Exodus chapter 12, verses 29 through 51, and we're moving towards the end of the plagues. We're going to be looking at the 10th plague today, and the result of that. So we've been following the story of Moses being called by God to lead the Israelites who had been enslaved by the Egyptians for over 400 years and to lead them out. And this is a big battle confrontation between the gods of Egypt and the God of Israel, who is proving to be superior with all these plagues. And this final plague, the killing of the firstborn, we're going to see fleshed out. So remember, Pharaoh had been warned of this earlier, that this was indeed going to be coming. And he was stubborn. His heart was hardened. He was not going to let him go. Remember that all the stuff that would happen, the Egyptians would have totally collapsed their economy, would have caused them into chaos. And then we get this final part of the story now, where finally the Pharaoh says to the Israelites that, yes, you can finally go. So let's just jump into verse 29 here. It says, "At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock." Right? So this is just a cataclysmic event. Remember, none of the other plagues had really touched and deliberately taken a human life, right? So a lot of it was cattle, a lot of it was inconvenience, a lot of it was just really annoying. Some sickness involved, and boils, and frogs, and blood, all that kind of stuff. But this one is really going after, the heartstrings of the Pharaoh and taking human life here. Verse 30 says, "And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead." Right? So this impacted everyone, right? So we see that Pharaoh gets up in the middle of the night, and this affected every person, every household. And obviously, with the loss of life, there's a great cry. Verse 31, "Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, 'You go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also.'" This is a really interesting thing. So finally Pharaoh goes and says, "You can go." Remember, after some of the plagues, Pharaoh would be like, "Okay, you can just take the men. Okay, you can take the women. Okay, you can take women and children, but leave the herds here." Right now he's like, "You get to take everyone. Okay, just get out of here, go." But even in the midst of this, right? Because Pharaoh is seeing all this stuff, and remember, this is really challenging his perception on who God is, who is the most powerful, right? Because he was kind of the incarnation of a God himself, was the thought process there. And finally, he's just kind of have to humble himself. It's like, "Hey, you all go." And then as he's going, though, "And bless me also." I find that pretty interesting, and I think that's how a lot of people interact with God. Okay, God, I'm not really going to follow you. I'm not going to listen to you, but I want to be on your team. I want you to bless me. I really don't want to obey you. I don't want to, do all the stuff that you've asked me to, but please bless me. I want the benefits of you. And that's not how we can barter with God. But we just see, I just find that really interesting, as that's the last thing Pharaoh says to Moses and Aaron. Verse 33. Okay, so the plague happens. Now and he says, "Okay, you can go now." The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, right? They were like, "Get out of here. Okay, we've had all these catastrophes, and now we have the firstborn of all our families are gone. You guys get out of here." For they said, "We shall all be dead," right? They're like, what's the only thing that can happen next, right? The only thing that can happen next is we just get wiped out completely. We've already lost everything. Economy, our livestock, our plants, our farms, everything. Now even our firstborn, what's left is, it's just the rest of us. We're all going to be dead. Verse 34 says, "So that the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. And the people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold and for clothing." Right? So they had asked, "Hey, can we, have your gold and silver and stuff?" And sure enough, the Egyptians are like, "Just take it, just go, take this and go." Some of it might have been with, frustration. A lot of them was just like, "Hey, we're just scared, and so we're just going to give you this stuff in good riddance to you." That was probably kind of the most likely thing in here. Verse 36, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians, right? And so part of this is God's favor, right? So we see the distinguishing things between Egypt and Israel, and so now we see the Egyptians showing favor to Israel, and that's one of the things that often that we have and throughout the Bible is that God's people receive favor in a variety of different ways. Okay, sometimes from other people groups, sometimes from God Himself, and this is just one of the things that happens. This isn't why we follow God, but this is one of the things that happens when we do obey and trust Him. Is that God just opens doors? He shows us favor, and so we're seeing that with the people here. Verse 37: and the people of Israel journey from Ramses to Succoth. Okay, and so they're heading east, right? So where Egypt is, in kind of a northeast Africa. And where the Israelites are heading is they're heading, going east, and then they'll head up north towards Israel. And so Ramses and Succoth are kind of more towards moving east. Okay, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Okay, so this would roughly, people believe, if that's a literal figure, and there's some debate, just so you know, there's some debate on how many actually left, what we see evidence for, something like that. This roughly happens kind of somewhere between 1200 BC to 1600 BC, depending on your date. So it's kind of a big date period that they're not quite sure. This is a long time ago, obviously. And so they're not sure if they see the evidence of this many people traveling throughout, that they would see that. But according to the Bible here, it says about 600,000 men, which would have put probably about 2 million people. Okay, if there's women and children. Okay, so it's at least describing a pretty large group of people in this Exodus. Okay, verse 38. This is something really interesting. It says, a mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And so, what is happening as the Israelites are going out, it says there's a mixed multitude that also went with them. So what this is saying is non-Israelites ended up leaving with the Israelites. Okay, and so there's kind of a couple of scenarios that this is likely to be. Some of it could be some of the Egyptians who, through this whole situation, were like, this is the one true God. Okay, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. We've seen Him be revealed to us through all these plagues, one after another, and we're convinced that this is the one true God, and so we're going to go with the Israelites. Okay, so that's possibly one group, and I think there's some verses in Leviticus that kind of confirm that being the reality. But also, there was possibly some other servants and slaves who were, in Egypt at the time as well, along with the Israelites. I mean, Egypt was a powerhouse, right? And they had probably multitudes from other places and stuff. And so some of them may have left with the Israelites as well. So potentially people who weren't necessarily even believers, but are like, hey, let's get out while the getting's good. So we have those, but it's interesting of how there are non-Israelites leaving with them. And so we see that. Now also it says a mixed multitude of the people and much livestock, flocks, and herds. So they're getting all kinds of resources, flocks, herds, gold, silver, as they're leaving out. So they're not leaving out empty-handed. They're leaving with a lot of resources. Verse 39, it says, and they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. Right? So it's talking about this thing later on. They'll celebrate with unleavened bread, as it was kind of described earlier in this chapter about the celebrating of the feast of the Passover. But this is just kind of describing it of what had happened. They didn't even have time for it to rise because they were just getting out of there right away. As soon as they got the green light, they're out. Verse 40, it says, the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And so, this is given a very specific number. Like I said, there's some debate on some of these numbers. Typically, what I like to do is just go with the numbers that are given, and and take it more as literal. But some people are like, oh, it's just kind of a round estimate number. Anyway, I'm not going to go into tons of the debate around the numbers because I don't think it's super important. But there was, hundreds of years, generations and generations of slavery that had happened, and it says they're coming out. Like I said, typically I go with the literal sense whenever I can, and so I'd go with that as well. Of how many years they were in Egypt. Verse 42, it says, it was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. I love how this phrase was. It says it was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land. Remember, this is God's work of deliverance. Okay, this is not just like, oh, there's some random things, maybe some weird natural disasters, and they kind of just eventually went out. No, this was God's hand all along preparing for them to leave. And it says he had a night of watching. Like he is watching. It's like, it's kind of like this parent watching his kids, making sure they're safe and taking the right steps, going the right direction. I love this kind of picture of God. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations, right? So there's this kind of tie-in with kind of how they view things now, of just this night of watching. Okay, verse 43, and this is going to give kind of some different instructions for celebrating the Passover. It says, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. Right? So part of this is because there was a mixed company that came out. Now they're having some rules in which, okay, here's how we're going to celebrate this feast in the future. Right? Okay, but so every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you've circumcised. So remember, circumcision is this act of, here is the physical act that shows that you are part of the deal between God and the Israelites, right? And they did it by circumcision, not really something you can fake, something to be obvious. And so hey, if you have a slave or servant and they want to participate, or you want them to participate, you got to have it circumcised. Verse 45, no foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. Okay, now this is a really, really interesting phrase, that you shall not break any of its bones. A lot of people, most scholars believe that this was one of the reasons why Jesus also, it was prophesied about him and fulfilled, that none of his bones were broken when he was crucified. Right? Because Jesus is the Passover lamb. Okay, this is one of those crazy things in the Bible where it's just like, oh man, there's some people, oh, there's just made up stories. These are just, this stuff is set up 1500 years ish, 12, 1300, 14 before Jesus. And this is all pointing to Jesus, and Jesus fulfills all these things, and he becomes the Passover lamb. And even this Passover lamb, the bones were not broken, and Jesus, none of his bones were broken. Okay, just a phenomenal thing. If you're thinking about the New Testament, thinking about Jesus, how this ties in, why this stuff even matters, right? Because all this Old Testament stuff, it all points to Jesus. Okay, and we're going to start reading about the sacrificial system that is going to be instituted later, all the different laws, 613 laws that are declared later to Moses and stuff, and all of them are pointing to Jesus, and Jesus fulfills them. And this is just one of those amazing things, that this story is not just a story for ancient Israel. This story is a story for us, because we can kind of look back on this story and also how it ties in with the person of Jesus, and it's just kind of mind-blowing sometimes of like how incredible all these dots get connected with Jesus. Even the fact of his bones not breaking. Verse 47, it says, all the congregation of Israel shall keep it, right? This is something for everyone. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all of his males be circumcised. Right? So it's saying, hey, okay, this is for Israel, but hey, there's going to be people over the time, because God is the God of everyone. And they're going to want to be part of what God is doing. And it says, there's going to be people entering your land, and they're going to like look and say, yeah, we believe that God is the God. Like Yahweh is the God. The Israelite God is the God of gods. And we want to be part of this. And so it says, if a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all its males be circumcised. So he says, hey, you have to circumcise them still though. Right? They got to be grafted in. Okay. And there's some New Testament language here, because us as non-Jews, later on, we're grafted in a similar way as these sojourners. Okay, one of the names, or the name that we chose as a church, was Sojourn, with some of these things in mind, because we're these temporary travelers, but we still have this one God, and someday we're going to be united with him. Right? So really kind of cool thing. So if these strangers do, make sure they're circumcised. And then it says, then he may come near and keep it. he shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. Okay, and this is really talking about, there's this idea of kind of who's in and who's out, right? And God is really, really clear to Moses here, giving these instructions to Moses and Aaron, that says, you have to be, like, you can't just sort of follow God. Like, oh, here's when it's communion, right? I think Pharaoh was trying to do this earlier. Oh, you can go, but, on your way out, please bless me, right? I think I know you're right, but I just want the benefits of God, but I don't want to leave. God here is like, hey, here's how you're in. Like, you got to be in. Like, there's no fence sitting. There's no ways that you can kind of do both things. Like, you're either in or you're not. And so if you're in, you got to be fully in. You got to be circumcised, right? And you're not just going to be circumcised just, for a good time on a Friday night, right? This is really like, hey, man, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to be in, right? And so he's saying that, but it's also kind of this picture of like, here's how you be part of the kind of covenant people of God, and there is a way for you to be part of it, right? There's this inclusivity even here to people who say, this is the one true God. I want to be part of following God. And it says they can do it, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. For verse 49 says, there shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. Right? So the people living among you, okay, there was, some semblance of like, hey, you can be part of us, but you can't be part of us and live your same way. You can't be part of us and live your pagan religion. You can't be part of us and do all this kind of stuff. If you're going to join us, you got to be fully in. Okay? You got to be fully in. There's no other ways, or else you're not going to be able to stay around. Verse 50, it says, all the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. And so we get this kind of final picture here where they go through, the final plague hits. Pharaoh says, you got to get out of here. And they finally get out. They're leaving. They take their flocks and their herds and the gold and silver, and they give these final instructions, and then they finally get to walk out. I can't imagine of just that moment as they're like, leaving their houses, walking out of town, and the feeling and the freedom and the victory, but also maybe some of the fears of like, is this really happening? Is this really gonna stick and stuff? And we'll see as this story unfolds. But what an amazing part of the story. We see the hand of God, the power of God, with this death angel, the killing of the firstborn, which isn't one of the nicer parts of the story, but that's what God was doing to show and reveal Himself. But also it was the final last straw that actually convinced Pharaoh that finally let them go. And this was just such a victorious moment. I don't want to minimize how incredible this moment would have been as they're walking out. Like we were in our homes that night as slaves, and we walk out the door as free people. We've never been enslaved. At least I've never been enslaved. I can't imagine the victory, but I do know some of the victory that I felt of overcoming sin, of being able to walk in the freedom that only God has. And I mean, that's just a taste of what these people experience of like true freedom. Like, we just walked out the door and we're free, right? Like, we're not slaves anymore. This is really happening. Well, what an amazing thing. What a moment that would have been seared in their lives. There's those moments that are seared in your minds of, like, I remember when I first heard about 9/11, and that moment's like seared in my brain forever. I remember where I was. I remember what was going on there. This moment seared in their minds forever. Like, we walked out the door and we're walking out of town, with this vast crowd. What a momentous occasion, and the chatter of like, wow, God is so amazing. He let us out. He did this thing. And that's just part of what it looks like to follow God. It's like this little bit of a taste of the kingdom of God, right? That Jesus later spoke about. He's like, hey, the kingdom is at hand. We can have that same rest. I was just reading in Hebrews just this morning as part of my daily Bible reading, and it talks about this rest that we can have. That's only found in God, and these people are supposed to be walking towards the promised land, and it's just this just amazing moment that we can have because God is the God of freedom, right? There's no one else that gives it to it, but God is the God of freedom.